Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library, and I have a great story to tell you. Tonight, we are going to have another deep dive into history as I tell you about the history of salt, its role, and its importance in human societies around the world since prehistory. Like other products I have told you about in the past, salt provides a window on plenty of aspects of human history. Techniques from the preservation of food to mining, but also urbanism, conflicts, trade, even the birth of taxation systems that could support states. Many other things that will surprise you are linked to salt. This one is one of the most significant commodities in the history of mankind. But first, allow me to take just a few seconds of your time to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project. Get more of it and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to contribute directly to our work financially. Our least expensive tier is $3.50 per month, but it doesn't mean you will get less. We let people contribute what they wish to or can, and everyone gets everything that is on our page. Because the world is a better place when the sun shines for everyone. You will gain access to several exclusive episodes. We now have 17 of them, and we do add a new one every month. And also you can download all our episodes with and without background sounds to listen offline. And as a token of our gratitude, we also offer advance releases on Fridays instead of Sundays to our patrons as well. We have added links to Patreon as well as links to different streaming options, which may be better suited for you. You will find a link in the description of the episode. But before we begin, let's take a moment to prepare for our journey ahead. If you'd like, gently close your eyes and let your daily concerns drift away. Find a position that feels natural and comfy. Perhaps make small adjustments until you're perfectly comfortable. Now, draw in a deep, nourishing breath. And as you release it, do it softly. Notice how your body responds. Feel the warmth flowing from your shoulders down through your neck, melting away any tension. Let your facial muscles become soft, your jaw loose, your fingers naturally open, and your legs completely at ease. As you settle into this peaceful state, my voice will be your gentle companion as we begin our exploration together. So now, let's continue our journey into the history of salt. If we consider our entire planet, salt, sodium chloride, is arguably very abundant, almost endless. 1 liter of seawater contains on average 30 grams, or about 1 ounce of salt, which means that there are thousands of billions of tons currently dissolved in the Earth's oceans. To give you an idea, if you take 1 liter of fresh water, you need to add 7 teaspoons of salt to approximate the kind of concentration in seawater on Earth. It's a lot. And in total, there are hundreds of tons of sea salt on Earth per human being. And this is not even counting land-based sources of salt that actually provide the vast majority of salt production nowadays. Salt mines are where the sodium chloride mineral called halite, rock salt, is extracted. These rock salt deposits occur in sedimentary geological layers that resulted millions of years ago from the evaporation of seas or enclosed salty lakes. These salt beds may be very thick, up to 1,000 feet or more than 300 meters, and the crystals of salt mined inside them also came from seas that disappeared long ago. So salt is abundant, but it is not available everywhere. It is not always refined. It needs to be extracted either by making water evaporate or mining rock salt. It needs to be transported, and this is what constituted its value for thousands of years. The work, transportation, and for a long time, the taxes too. I will tell you about that a bit later in our little talk. The need, the thirst for salt, seems to have emerged around the world during the Neolithic, particularly due to the development of agriculture. And why is that? First, because of the change in diet that came with agriculture. Prehistoric hunters and gatherers got enough salt naturally for their physical needs in their diet, especially from the organs of their prey, or fish and shellfish. When humans transitioned to agriculture, the new plant-based diet no longer provided enough salt. The quantities needed for that were small, but salt had to be found somewhere, and that meant living near the sea or finding rock salt. It was relatively marginal, but it seems an alternative source of salt was to burn some plants adapted to salt-rich environments, like glasswort, and obtain crystals from the ashes. But that was never a major source of salt. So trading salt became a necessity for all agricultural communities that could not produce their own salt. We know, for example, that bread was very often salted, including thousands of years ago. That was certainly for the taste, but also for health reasons, since humans had observed that a small ration of salt did them good. But the main reason behind the need for salt in the Neolithic was agriculture itself, for multiple things. When a community lives from agriculture, it needs ways of conserving foods. Cereals remain edible when stored in dry conditions, but for most other foods, be it milk-based products, fruits, meat, fish, eggs, a process is needed to keep them edible. They could be dried or smoked, but some of the best options used salt, either by salting them directly or keeping them directly in a solution with salt and water, brine, with different techniques. For some foods like cheese, salt is necessary to ensure preservation. And for others like fish and meat, it is very convenient, often more efficient than smoking. We will elaborate later on these preservation methods, but as you see, the sedentary lifestyle that came with agriculture required salt for that first reason. And a second reason was that domesticated animals also needed salt. Milk-producing cows need salt, and so do almost all other farm animals. Exceptions among domesticated animals are dogs and cats that don't need any salt supplement, essentially because they don't sweat much and don't lose their salt in this way. Herbivores in nature instinctively recognize salty earth or stones and lick them for salt. In farming, they have to be provided with salt stones. A practice that actually appeared with agriculture was the salting of hay after harvest. A small quantity of salt was mixed with hay so the animals would eat it. And on top of that, salt would absorb humidity and help preserve hay for longer. So concretely, several archaeological sites from several thousand years ago in Turkey, in the Middle East, or in the Balkans are the first to show the use of salt for agriculture and food preservation. Some small remains of salt were found on pottery, or little pits that are thought to have been dug to conserve shells in a highly salty environment. Brine pits that were hermetically closed. All this tells us that thousands and thousands of years ago, the production of salt and its trade were already a major preoccupation for people, probably ahead of any other material or commodities, because salt was necessary for the most basic needs for food. Now, on top of that, food was not the only use of salt in ancient times. It was also necessary for important crafts, such as the tanning of leather or skins in general. Earlier in prehistory, skins and furs were treated essentially by cleaning them up thoroughly with stone scrapers that are often found in prehistoric sites, and they were dried, which worked but did not guarantee the long-term preservation of skins. Tanning these skins was progress. It improved their texture, their useful life, their flexibility, and made it possible to use them as clothes or make containers with them. The tanning process started with a long maceration of skins in brine to ensure their long-term preservation and prevent rot. Yet another ancient use of salt was for glazing pottery and ceramics. Typically, pottery would be fired with a coating that turned to enamel, and this also required salt. The Egyptians were among the first to produce that kind of glazed ceramics. Agricultural practices led to an increasingly sedentary way of life among human populations, and with it, the preservation of food and an explosion of material culture with many more man-made objects using skin or these glazed ceramics. And as this way of life turned into a norm, from China to the Mediterranean to the Americas in the past 5,000 to 6,000 years, the need for salt grew exponentially. As the first states and the first empires appeared in antiquity, salt became an even bigger deal, not just in daily life. It was economically, financially, and sometimes even politically relevant, to the point that in various locations around the world, the extraction of salt became systematic, almost industrial, either with mines of rock salt or salt evaporation ponds. An example of ancient salt mining is the region of Salzkammergut in Austria in the 2nd millennium BC. during the expansion of a culture called the Hallstatt culture. This region of Austria became a major center of salt production thanks to its mines. The first large mines appeared around 1300 BC. And in the first millennium BC, around 800, salt was extracted almost industrially by hundreds of workers, producing tens of thousands of tons annually that could be exported. To the south of Austria, Rome, which was barely a group of villages by 800 BC, owned part of its expansion in the following centuries to its control of salt marshes at the mouth of the Tiber River. Salt marshes from which salt could be obtained by evaporation. Early Romans put their hands on this salt production site to secure their supply of salt. A salt marsh is a coastal region, an ecosystem that is regularly flooded by the tides. It needs to be relatively flat and close to the sea, obviously. Many plants cannot grow in a salt-rich environment, but some can. They are adapted to it. Grasses, herbs, and shrubs that are salt-tolerant are typically found in these ecosystems. Now, in or near salt marshes, it is convenient to create salt evaporation ponds. The tides will flood them with salt water. The ponds can be closed with little dikes that retain the water on a large, flat expanse. Then it evaporates and the salt can be harvested. The salt supply chain would remain a major preoccupation for the Romans for centuries, especially for their armies. Salted food could make them less dependent on the lands they conquered. They could transport their own food. There is even this legend that Roman soldiers were partially paid in salt, which is not really substantiated, but it is something that keeps being repeated. At most, they could have received vouchers or rights for rations of salt as benefits. But what is true is that the word salary comes from Latin for salt, sal. Ancient Austria or ancient Rome are just examples among many. Salt production and trade were ubiquitous around the world in all sedentary cultures, from Africa, Asia, Europe, or the Americas. And when there were states or even more empires, this production and trade of salt were always seen as something strategic. Populations depended on it. Armies did too. And so it was legitimate for states to intervene in this trade, sometimes for regulation, but more often as a source of income. And here we touch on the need for early states to find funding that paid for their organization, administration, military, diplomacy. All of this needs funding, which meant taxes. In modern states, the largest sources of taxes are taxes on income from individuals and businesses, or taxes on consumption, like sales tax, also called value-added tax, VAT. In ancient times, none of this was possible. You can only collect sales tax when all, or close to all, retailers have an accounting system and payment systems that allow for control over their activity, which is why sales tax really started to become a thing in the 19th century. Before that, it was impossible to implement. Income taxes were more of a possibility. But there wasn't a way of establishing how much a person or a business made at a time when there was no bookkeeping and only part of transactions were done with actual money, coins. The bulk of transactions in antiquity, especially in daily life, were barter, and more often than not, people would be paid in nature with food or clothes, things they needed. Still, the tradition to agriculture and sedentary life allowed for taxation. Peasants would have to give a certain share of their production. That was the tax base of all ancient agrarian civilizations, like in Mesopotamia, China, India, or Egypt. But that was not always enough, and the need for funding was rarely fully satisfied. So quickly enough, when urban cultures reached a certain degree of complexity and material wealth, and with it a certain level of trade, the idea of putting taxes on specific products arose, products that could be tightly controlled. That included the first tariffs on traded goods. The goods arrived at a given port or at the doors of a city. They could come from afar or just the neighboring countryside, but in any case they had to transit at a certain point where they could be controlled and taxed, hence the appearance of smuggling, probably at the same time as the tariffs. Or you could tax products that had few production sites because these were also easy to control. As one of the first types of production to be industrialized, salt was the perfect product to tax. Few producers, and production are impossible to hide, whether it is in a mine or an evaporation pond, and everyone needed the product anyway, so demand was guaranteed. This is why taxes on salt appeared, or alternatively, direct exploitation of salt by the state that sold salt to its subjects for revenues. The second option was the case in ancient Egypt. Salt was a state monopoly, and it would be sold or used as a form of currency, a means of payment for laborers. One of the earliest documented salt taxes appeared in ancient China. By the beginning of the imperial China, under the Qin dynasty, in the 3rd century BC, the state taxed both production and trade to fund its campaigns and its spending on infrastructure. In China, this system evolved more and more toward the state monopoly that was formalized under the following dynasty, the Han. And this system persisted for centuries. It was still a major income source under the Tang dynasty, hundreds of years later. As I mentioned earlier, salt and its taxation were also important in ancient Rome. One of the numerous roads that appeared due to the salt trade, the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, owes its name to this trade. It connected Rome to the Adriatic Sea on the other side of the Italian peninsula. Salt production was generally more efficient along the Adriatic because the waters of the sea are more salty, and it became the primary source of salt for the city of Rome itself. As the city grew and needed ever more, the antique importance of salt continued during the Middle Ages. Certain cities, starting with Venice, owed their early prosperity to salt. Venice made it a monopoly early and always tightly controlled this trade. In medieval Europe, as the salt industry kept the same characteristics, a few large production sites and universal demand, as it remained vital for food preservation and industries like leather, making it the perfect product to tax. Much like gasoline today, demand was guaranteed and the trade can be controlled. So all medieval states in Europe had, to one degree or another, a system of tax or state monopoly. In particular, France had an infamous and very unpopular tax called the gabelle, which is a good example. This tax was introduced in the 13th century, and it quickly became hated, because in order to boost its returns, the state started to force people to buy fixed quantities of salt at inflated prices, regardless of their needs. So that was extortion. They might as well have kept the salt and just taken people's money. But salt was used as the pretext for that particular tax. It turned into a significant revenue source for the French crown, which made it impossible to eliminate. But it also led to unrest at different periods and was only abolished much later with the French Revolution. What seemed particularly unfair with this tax, the gabelle, was how regressive it was. Everyone, rich or poor, paid the same absolute amount, which for poor people was exorbitant, and for the rich, almost imperceptible. Nowadays, taxes that are called regressive or unfair are typically flat taxes, the same sales tax rate for every income, regardless of the income level. With such taxes, everyone pays the same percentage. So the rich will contribute more than the poor. But a common critique of flat taxes is that they hit the poor harder because they have less to spare. This is why in all countries, the income tax system has brackets. The more you earn, the higher the marginal tax rate on your income is going to be. These progressive taxes coexist with taxes like sales tax or value-added tax that are a form of flat tax, same rate for everyone. The common critique of sales tax, though, is that the poor consume all or close to all of their income. They cannot save money, so they pay sales tax on everything they earn because they have to spend it to consume it. On the other hand, the rich who can save money are only going to pay sales tax on the income they spend for consumption. So, in total, they may pay more sales tax in absolute terms because they consume more. But the sales tax they pay as a percentage of their income is going to be lower than for people who earn less. But the gabelle was worse than that. It was a fixed amount per head, not even a percentage. And this is what made it so regressive. It was punitive for poor people, who were the vast majority of the French population at the time, and painless for the rich. This is why it came to represent the arbitrary unfairness of the old order in France, and together with plenty of other factors, of course, it contributed to the French Revolution that eliminated it. Another example of an unpopular salt tax, much more recently, was a salt tax enforced in India by the British colonial government in the 19th and 20th centuries. The government had a monopoly on production and imposed duties on its sale. And again, as everyone needed salt, including the poor, it became very unpopular to the point that it turned into a symbol of colonial oppression and led to a famous protest, the Salt March, in 1930, headed by Gandhi. The march drew attention and galvanized the cause of independence. Here again, it was only one factor among many others, and it is likely that, salt tax or not, India would have become independent, but it played a role. In the U.S., there was never that kind of exorbitant salt tax that existed everywhere. Also because in modern times, the tolerance to that kind of very regressive tax had lowered. Actually, in Europe too. At the time of American independence, and later, these sort of taxes on salt disappeared or became economically way less significant in the 19th century. During the American Civil War, the Confederacy shortly imposed a salt tax to fund its war effort, but it ended with the war in 1865. So in the 19th century, salt taxes declined and were eliminated everywhere around the world by the mid-20th century. Improved transportation and industrial production had made the price of salt drop. Salt was more accessible and very cheap, so its value as a taxable commodity was no longer there. And this is how we arrived at the present day, when salt is no longer subject to special taxation. It has sales tax for the final consumer, that's all. When salt production remains state-controlled or regulated, it is now more about quality control than revenue generation. Still, what remained of this long-lasting taxation of salt, and may just have started to recede a few generations ago, is the association between salt taxes and oppression in old industrialized and ex-colonial nations alike. These centuries of regressive taxation of salt lingered on in memories for some time, even after the disappearance of these specific taxes. But let's return to the Middle Ages now, because this period saw a lot of new developments around salt production and trade. Depending on the regions of Europe, there were different production methods. Inland, salt mines kept functioning, but they depended a lot on the availability of the resource. The largest ones were in Poland, Austria, and Germany, around the Mediterranean or the Atlantic coast, from Portugal to the middle of France. Salt was essentially obtained by evaporation in evaporation ponds. Theoretically, any coastal region could produce salt, but for evaporation to work, it takes a relatively dry and warm climate. Evaporation didn't work that well in Northern Europe and Great Britain because these regions were too wet. The evaporation ponds could also freeze more often, and so other methods were favored. In England in particular, salt would be extracted from mines and from naturally salted springs, waters that went through layers of rock salt or brine underground and arrived near the surface with a lot of salt. These waters were boiled to get the salt. This technique was prominent in England and Austria, along mines or in the east of France, and even more than in antiquity, this method of extraction of salt required a degree of industrialization. These were early industrial plants, long before the Industrial Revolution, at a time when there were no real factories at all, and the only proto-industrial sites were around mines, sometimes ceramic or glass production sites, or the salt production facilities. Yet another production method was from peat, which sounds weird, but it worked. Peat is an accumulation of decayed vegetation or organic matter. When dried, it could be used as fuel, a low-quality alternative to coal, but easier to retrieve because it could be collected from peatlands or bogs. The ashes from peat were often rich in salt. So these ashes were collected, cleaned up, and refined to eliminate the rest. This gave salt, which was called peat salt in the regions where it was produced, especially Flanders and the Netherlands, where there were no salt springs and no peat, and the climate was not appropriate for evaporation ponds. Brine remained the option. Brine can be any solution of salt and water, ranging from the concentration of seawater, about 3.5%, up to around 26%. It is not more than 26% salt, because this corresponds to the saturation point of water. In other words, water can no longer absorb more salt, and any additional salt will just float on it instead of dissolving. The Dead Sea, for example, is close to the saturation level. So brine occurs naturally on the surface where there is partially evaporated seawater, or it can be found underground if it was trapped. If they are really rich in salt, salted springs are brine, or it can be a byproduct of salt mining. In different concentrations, brine can be used in industrial processes, or cooking, or food processing. And if you boil it in kilns, you can also separate salt and water to collect the salt. So this was a frequent method in the north of Europe, especially in Denmark, where it was documented early in the Middle Ages. And speaking of Denmark and Northern Europe, this region also became a place of intense salt trade during the Middle Ages. Trade in the Baltic Sea and the North Sea during the medieval period relied on different products, but among them, salt and salted fish were crucial. Salt as the main commodity for food preservation and industry, fish as food that also needed a lot of salt to be processed and sold from Finland to Great Britain. The Kingdom of Denmark in medieval times built its prominence in Northern Europe on its control of trade in the Baltic and the North Sea. Apart from its geography at the limit of both seas that gave it control of waterways, it owned this to its salt production. The Baltic Sea was very rich in fish, but its salinity was low, and so in order to process all this fish and export it, during the Middle Ages, the Baltic Sea's abundance of fish, particularly herring, was so great that in its coastal regions herring was often less expensive than bread. Processing this fish to sell abroad was an attractive trade, but it required salt. And so the controller of salt was well placed to be able to dominate that trade. Denmark did it for a while and later the Netherlands. Thanks to their salt from Zeeland cities of the Hanseatic League. This association of trading cities from Northern Europe competed with them, buying salt from German and Polish mines. But depending on the prices, they sometimes sent ships to buy salt in the Netherlands or in France. And so the salt trade stimulated trade in other goods, Hanseatic or Danish ships would load timber and fur from the Baltic, sell them in the Netherlands or France, and return with salt. The Netherlands benefited a lot from this northern trade in the 14th and 15th centuries, planting the seeds of their future prosperity. They were well positioned to serve as intermediary between France, where they bought wine and salt, and England, where they found cloth or wool. And they took these goods to the Baltic, where they could buy fur, leather, tar, hemp used to make ropes. This started to turn the Netherlands into a trade hub and plant the seeds of this commercial and seafaring culture that would send them on the oceans of the world in the 16th century. The development of this trade had important repercussions on all the regions concerned. It stimulated herding for wool in Great Britain, evaporation ponds in France, especially in Brittany and the Atlantic coast. Baltic countries developed the production of supplies for ships, and all of this was connected to the central importance of salt. Another example of transformation and economic rise based on salt, and at a later stage would be the city of Liverpool in England in the 17th to the 19th centuries. It all began because there were rich deposits of rock salt nearby Cheshire, where salt had been extracted since Roman times. It was not new, but in the 17th century, a new potential mine of rock salt was discovered near Northwich. And this was indeed a game changer, because it was extremely pure, purer than sea salt, which made it ideal for industrial uses and for cooking. Liverpool became the key refining and export center for this Cheshire salt, which could be used in industries like glassmaking, metalwork, or the early chemical production like soda manufacturing. But importantly, this salt started to be used to preserve fish, especially fish from the very abundant fisheries of Newfoundland in Canada. This fish was then exported to the West Indies for colonial products like coffee and sugar, progressively turning Liverpool in the 17th century into a gateway for colonial products. And this laid the foundation for Liverpool's prosperity. It started to grow as a salt export center and transformed itself into a colonial port as a trade of colonial products. And the slave trade overtook salt as its main activity. But the salt industry was still there. It peaked in the 19th century, and from colonial port, Liverpool transformed itself again into an industrial center with chemistry, manufacturing, shipbuilding, all of which had been originally impulsed by salt alongside old industries. This salt production and trade declined in the 20th century, leaving Liverpool economically in trouble. But still, it had transformed from a relatively small port to a world-class port during the Industrial Revolution, largely due to salt. Nowadays, industry is the most important consumer of salt. The chemical industry alone absorbs half of the world's production, which is higher than ever. Soda, chloroauric acid, sodium carbonate, and bicarbonate. These are all products obtained from salt, or in which salt is used, and these products are manufactured in colossal quantities for all sorts of final products. But for a long time, as we have seen, the main use of salt was for food preservation. And you remember at the beginning, I told you there were different processes, different methods of food preservation using salt. So let's take a look at them and how they evolved throughout history. First, there is salting, one of the oldest methods and one of the possible forms of curing, which is to say, the act of drawing moisture out of the food. That is what salt does to fish or meat. It desiccates by osmosis. Salt crystals are water hungry. They attract it out of the food. Salt is called hypertonic, which means it has a very high capacity to attract water out of another medium it is put in contact with. In a very salty environment in brine, living cells become dehydrated, which kills or at least deactivates them. And that's an important preserving virtue of salt. Most bacteria, fungi, and other pathogens cannot survive it. In practice, salting was often combined with smoking for better efficiency and for the taste. For example, bacon is salt-cured pork meat, which is often smoked. The same treatment was also typically applied to fish. In antiquity and the Middle Ages in Europe, herring was very often processed like this, and later cod, when it became abundant with North Atlantic fisheries. Salted meats and fish were not consumed immediately. Typically, the meat was first boiled in brine, which cooked it and filled it with salt. And then it was placed in dry salt in a barrel. The layers of salt in between layers of meat or fish preserved the food. But obviously it couldn't be eaten directly out of the barrel. It was way too salty. So it would be desalted first in water for hours, or cooked with other unsalted ingredients to reduce the concentration of salt. This method of salting was crucial to navigation in the age of sail. Ships were slow. They could stay weeks or months at sea, and the basic diet for mariners consisted of salted meat, beef, and pork and biscuit, which sounds probably better than it really was. Ship's biscuit, also called hardtack, was a kind of very dense and hard cracker made from flour and water with a bit of salt, cooked and dried completely for preservation. So it was food in the most basic sense, sustenance that was at the same time light, non-perishable for a long time. As long as it was kept away from rodents, it was also cheap. And this is why it was part of rations for navies and armies around the world until the 20th century. Now, something that makes meat less attractive when it is salted only with table salt is that it turns gray, and it doesn't look good even though it is edible. It was discovered in the 19th century that salt mixed with nitrates, such as saltpeter, would have the same preservation properties, but colored the meat red instead of gray. And this is why you find nitrates in all salted meats now, essentially for the color. So as you see, dry salting was an efficient, inexpensive, and easy way of preserving food, but not the only technique involving salt. Another one is brining. Brining is the treatment of food with brine, which is to say a high concentration solution of salt. The mechanism that preserves food is the salt, as with salting, but the difference is that the foods are left floating in highly salted water, often with other seasoning elements, to macerate for days, weeks, or months. Additions to brine may include spices, herbs, sugar, vinegar. The percentage of salt can vary depending on recipes, but most culinary traditions around the world have or had brining techniques. In Rome, for example, for centuries, the most used condiment was a salted sauce called garum, Garum. It was made with fermented fish organs and brine. The recipe was in the same category of recipes as Asian fish sauces today, such as the Vietnamese nuoc mam. Salt prevented rot and ensured its preservation. It was also used to add salt to a lot of recipes it was part of. The Romans adopted it, but it was in use earlier by the Greeks. We don't know the exact recipe because there was not just one. Each port of the Mediterranean had a way of preparing it with differences, including the ingredients. There could be seafood like oysters, not just fish, or the fermentation time and temperature would vary, or the percentage of salt. What is sure is that garum was consumed by all social classes. The liquid that floated at the surface of the container where the fermentation took place was considered to be the most subtle and mild in taste, so it was the priciest, and it seems to have been particularly expensive when its maker had a reputation for excellence. Under this higher grade garum sauce on top, there were different qualities. All the way down to the remains of the fish or shellfish at the bottom of the container that the poorest classes used to flavor their basic daily food that consisted of cooked cereals like porridge or a kind of pancake made of chickpea flour called farinata. There is an ancient Roman cookbook, a collection of recipes that was assembled in the 5th century AD or earlier. But by the end of the Western Roman Empire, in any case, this book is called Apicius or Apicius, and in this book, which is a major source of knowledge about ancient Roman cuisine, there are various recipes of stews, fish, meat, vegetables, many of which used garum as an ingredient. A variant of brining with an acidic medium that is heavily salted is pickling. Pickling can also dramatically extend the shelf life of food by either fermentation in brine or in vinegar, or a combination of both, often for taste, and also because they have antimicrobial properties. Herbs and spices such as garlic, cloves, cinnamon, or mustard seeds are added. And as you know, many different vegetables can be pickled, like cucumbers or onions. A variant of pickling that uses lactic acid fermentation is how fermented cabbage like sauerkraut or Korean kimchi is processed. These are fermented in a highly salted medium, which could sound paradoxical because I told you earlier that salt kills or deactivates microorganisms by desiccating their cells, and fermentation requires microorganisms. But it is a quantity issue. Salt will eliminate a lot of undesirable microbes, but not fully inhibit those that create lactic acid in a medium rich in carbohydrates and proteins. The fermentation of sauerkraut or kimchi is made in sealed containers, sealed from the air, and inside it, the medium becomes acidic, which ensures preservation. And salt is used generously in that process too, as an adjuvant for preservation for its antibacterial properties that control the fermentation process. So, as you see, food preservation with salt goes far beyond just throwing a piece of meat or fish into a barrel with salt. There are various processes, and on top of their original function, which was to preserve food, they have been used as many ways of developing flavor and changing the texture of food. And this certainly explains why all these methods that use salt, salting, brining, pickling, lactic acid fermentation, are still with us today, despite the rise of so many other ways to preserve food. The pivotal moment here is really the 19th and early 20th centuries, with the introduction of new options, especially canning in airtight containers, and the production of artificial cold that can extend shelf life dramatically by refrigerating or even freezing food. Modern canning for food preservation has origins in France in the years 1790. The government of revolutionary France that was fighting on many fronts and often with operations deep into foreign territory, with large armies that could no longer live off the land, because by the end of the 18th century, the size of the armies had grown dramatically to tens of thousands of men. So the government needed to anticipate the logistic needs of these armies, how to preserve and transport the rations to feed the soldiers, especially in winters, which would make French armies able to fight all year round. Whereas traditionally, in past centuries, large military operations only took place between the end of spring and fall. So a prize with a hefty sum was offered to the person who would come up with innovative ways of preserving and transporting food. A confectioner and brewer called Nicolas Appert came up with the method of canning. He had observed that food cooked inside a jar that was then sealed would not spoil unless the seals leaked. He didn't know why at the time. It would take several more decades to understand microorganisms and their role in food spoilage. That would be the work of Pasteur 50 years later. But the method was considered interesting, and it was tested. Technically, it worked, but the military use of the invention gave mixed results, because preparing food this way, sealing jars, was lengthy and complicated, and the containers were heavy, so it didn't really work great. Canning really took off with the invention of the tin can process, which started to be industrialized in Britain. It consisted of cooking in big quantities, transferring into metal cans that had been boiled to kill microbes, and sealing them with a weld. Still, these first food cans were relatively lengthy to make and expensive, so they expanded only slowly. By the mid-19th century, they were used on ships for long travels, or they were adopted by middle classes in Europe and America as a status symbol. If you could buy food cans, you had certain standards and a certain income. Canned foods look like something very basic today, but back then, we have to realize that it was the first alternative to ancestral food preservation methods. Smoking, drying, salting food, or keeping it in a root cellar to expand its shelf life. These ways of preserving food had been around for thousands of years, but now there was this new possibility, which looked like something almost magical: the possibility of eating certain fruits out of season, or that had been grown in another corner of the world. The novelty of imagining that food had been prepared months before and was still almost as fresh when you opened the can. In addition to canning, the other big 19th century innovation was refrigeration, that has become completely indispensable in our lives. But the discovery that cold could be generated artificially by controlled compression and expansion of a fluid, a gas, as a way to remove heat. This was really a game changer, not just for food preservation. It had plenty of other uses in air conditioning or industrial processes. Before refrigerators, there was no other way of refrigerating than cellars or ice preserves stocked during the winter and kept underground in big holes that could last for months when they were big enough. But of course, regular people did not have access to that kind of refrigeration. The first electric refrigerators that were initially big facilities for cold stores were introduced in the early 20th century and followed later by residential refrigerators. The very first models were manufactured in 1913 in the United States, in Indiana. And it took 2 or 3 decades for these appliances to become ever present in households. Here again, the introduction of these cold closets could only look like a marvel to our grandparents or great-grandparents who witnessed it. And this is how salt has become less present in food preservation in the past 100 years. With these new methods like canning, refrigeration, and lyophilization, freeze-drying, could also be mentioned. The perfect drying of food so that it can no longer spoil, even though it is a more marginal technique. But salt is extracted in bigger than ever quantities for all of its other uses, and it remains a vital commodity to our kind. We have reached the end of our story for tonight. You may now let go and fall asleep, or if you're not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, sleep well. Good night.